My name is Athena Exley. I'm 34 years old, and I hold an airline transport pilot license with 6,200 logged flight hours across 4 continents, 2 oceanic tracks, and weather systems that would make most people grip their armrest and pray to whoever they believed in. I say that not to impress you. I say it because you need to understand the kind of woman I am before you understand what happened that night. In aviation, there is no room for assumption. No space for ego to cloud the instrument panel. You read the data. You trust the numbers. You make the call, cleanly, correctly, without hesitation, because 300 people are asleep behind you, and the only thing standing between them and 38,000 feet of open air is your training and your judgment. That is who I am at work. That is who I have always been. So when Diane Marsh, my mother-in-law, 5 feet 4 inches of cashmere and quiet contempt, looked across a table set with Christofle silverware and hand-blown crystal and said, "Athena, darling, it must be so wonderful to finally be surrounded by people who've actually built something." I did not flinch. I did not stiffen. I did not reach for the Sancerre in front of me or let my jaw tighten or allow a single, useful flicker of emotion to cross my face. I smiled, warm, unhurried, the smile I use at 3 a.m. over the North Atlantic when the weather radar shows a line of convective activity I did not plan for. The smile that says, "I see you. I've already accounted for you. We will be fine." Then I picked up my water glass, and I started calculating. The dinner was held at Hargrove & Sons, 14th floor of the Belmont Tower, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city grid like a general studying a map before a campaign. Amber lighting engineered to make everyone look like the best version of themselves. No prices on the menu. A sommelier who appeared without being summoned, the way truly expensive service always operates, invisibly, flawlessly, in a manner designed to make you forget a human being made any decision at all. Daniel had described this evening as a casual family dinner. He had said this on a Tuesday, without breaking eye contact, while I was reviewing a loan covenant at the kitchen island. I had looked up. He had held the eye contact. I had said, "Okay." I wore the navy sheath dress anyway, structured at the shoulder, clean at the hem, the kind of piece that photographs well in any light and communicates nothing about the woman wearing it. Pilots learn this early. Don't give the weather more information than it needs. Don't let the environment read you before you've finished reading it. The guest list told me everything Daniel's Tuesday description had not. Diane had assembled 12 guests beyond the 2 of us, a curated audience that functioned less like family and more like a panel of observers at a performance she had been rehearsing for years. Her garden club occupied the social center. Margot Haynes, whose husband sat on 2 hospital boards. Cecilia Voss, whose daughter had just appeared in a regional lifestyle feature about women redefining legacy wealth. Portia Ashworth, who had never in my presence discussed anything other than property values, private school admissions, and the particular social sin of new money without taste. Then Whitney and Brad. Whitney Marsh, 33, Daniel's younger sister, equipped with a smile she deployed with the precision of someone who understood that warmth, when performed correctly, is more powerful than intelligence in certain rooms. She had been promised, not in writing, not in anything legally binding, but promised in the way Marsh family commitments were always made, over dinners and under chandeliers, a senior role at Keystone Hospitality Group. A promise Daniel had made on behalf of a company he did not own. Brad Calloway, Whitney's husband, 35. Sandy hair, a jaw built for a watch advertisement, and a career in consulting, that elegant professional category that functions as a holding pattern for ambitious men waiting for the right connection to land them somewhere real. And at the head of it all, Diane, who had arranged the seating herself, told me twice, with the satisfied precision of someone who had been choreographing this evening far longer than the evening itself suggested. My place card read, Athena. Not Athena Marsh, not Athena Exley. Just Athena. First name only. The way you label the chair of someone whose permanence in the room hasn't yet been decided by the people running it. I was seated to Daniel's left. One position removed from center, from the gravitational point of a long table where the eye naturally falls. A small displacement, the kind of social geometry most people don't notice because it operates below conscious awareness. I always notice, if you have ever walked into a room where the entire table already holds a version of you that you didn't create and were never consulted about, drop a comment. Because what I am describing is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It simply is the way a weather system simply is. Ambient, encompassing, and entirely capable of bringing down an aircraft if you don't read it correctly from the beginning. Daniel was in his element from the moment we sat down. He has a specific posture for these events. I had studied it the way I study pre-flight weather charts, looking for patterns beneath the surface. Shoulders back, one hand loose on the tablecloth, Barolo in the other, the relaxed authority of a man who has never once walked into a room and quietly wondered whether he belonged there. He smiled at Margot. He laughed at something Brad said. He leaned toward Cecilia when she spoke, giving her the full attention posture that men like Daniel deploy without thinking, the unconscious gift of focus, offered so automatically they don't notice the giving. He wore the charcoal suit. I remembered the charcoal suit. I had helped him choose it for the Harrove Capital meeting 2 years ago, the meeting where we finalized the equity structure that brought them in as 20% stakeholders in Keystone Hospitality Group, LLC. I had prepared the presentation deck, run the pro forma projections across 3 scenarios, sat across from 3 partners in their 60s, and walked them through our debt-to-equity ratio, RevPAR performance across existing properties, and the 5-year expansion roadmap that justified their capital commitment. Daniel had been in the lobby, on his phone, in the charcoal suit, looking exactly like what those partners needed to believe they were investing in. I had never told them that the man in the lobby was listed on the operating agreement as a 10% non-managing stakeholder. They hadn't asked, nobody ever asks, when the face in the lobby is the right kind of face. Daniel's company just landed a new contract, Diane announced, before the first course arrived. She said Daniel's company, with the ease of long habit, the way people say the sun, its origins unexamined, its existence simply assumed. The revel, she added, gesturing toward her son with the proprietary warmth of a collector mentioning a valuable piece. Margot leaned forward. The Revel? On Calloway Street? That's the one, Daniel said. Smooth. Practiced. The Revel was a boutique hotel in the Arts District. 4 stories of restored 1920s brick, $480 a night rooms, a minibar curated by a local food journalist, rainfall showers, and an occupancy rate that had exceeded projection in each of its first 2 operating years. It had taken 14 months to bring to opening day. 14 months of zoning variance applications, neighborhood board hearings, and a near-catastrophic contractor crisis in month 3 when our general contractor walked off a job that was 40% complete, leaving us holding 2 outstanding subcontractor invoices and a structural timeline that had to be rebuilt from nothing. I had handled that crisis personally. 11 days of renegotiating scope with a replacement firm, restructuring the draw schedule to protect our liquidity, and managing 3 separate calls with Harrove Capital's operations liaison, who had begun, entirely reasonably, to raise concerns about timeline risk. Daniel had sent me 3 texts across those 11 days. The first, how's it going? The second, let me know if you need me. The third, a photograph of a brunch plate from a restaurant 2 blocks from the construction site. Avocado toast. Good lighting. No caption. How many properties now? Cecilia asked, tilting her champagne flute slightly toward Daniel, that small, unconscious social bow I had watched women perform for men like him my entire professional life. 7, he said, working on an 8th. We're working on an 8th, Diane corrected, And she meant we, as in the Marsh bloodline, the legacy she had decided her son was building. Her eyes moved to me for precisely one breath, the way your gaze crosses furniture when searching for something specific and confirms the furniture is not it, before returning, warm and certain, to Daniel. I breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out, box breathing. Pilots use it, surgeons use it. I had started using it in year 2 of my marriage at the first Marsh Christmas dinner, where Diane described Keystone Hospitality Group to her sister as Daniel's little project. I had been standing 6 feet away, having spent the previous 11 months negotiating our first property lease, securing a $2.3 million construction loan, and personally managing a renovation that came in 4% under budget. Daniel's little project. I had breathed then, too. "You must be so proud of him," Portia said. Directly to me. First time since we'd sat down. Her voice was warm. Her eyes were kind in the way that very precise instruments are. Elegant. Not despite their sharpness, but because of it. It's wonderful when a husband's success gives the whole family something to celebrate. A husband's success, not our success, not shared achievement. His, and by extension, my presence at this table was explained entirely by proximity to that success. I was visible because he was visible. My value in this room was a derivative quantity, calculated from his position rather than my own, and the seating arrangement and the conversation and every layered assumption across this linen tablecloth had been built, whether deliberately or simply through the deep, comfortable habit of years, to make this feel not cruel, but simply obvious. Whitney smiled into her champagne, a private smile, directed inward at something already known and already enjoyed. Brad laughed across the table with the full-body ease of a man who had decided, 30 minutes in, that the evening was going exactly as it should. Daniel reached over and touched the back of my hand. Brief, practiced, it read as tenderness from 3 seats away. Up close, in the specific pressure of his fingers and the precise timing of the touch, arriving not in a moment of genuine warmth, but in the half-second after Portia's comment, in the space where my response had not yet appeared. It felt like a transmission. "Stay quiet. This is going well. Don't make this complicated." I had been receiving that transmission for 9 years. Here is what they teach you early in instrument flight training. Spatial disorientation kills pilots. It happens when the cloud layer removes your visual horizon and your inner ear, your instincts, your body, your feelings, tells you the aircraft is level when it is banking hard. The rule is absolute and never debated. Trust the instruments, not your instincts. The Marsh family had been, in every social and emotional dimension, a sustained spatial disorientation environment. They had constructed a cloud layer, dense, consistent, years in the making, in which up was Daniel's name on the public business profile, and level was the story Diane told at garden club luncheons, and terrain was the legal and financial reality sitting in a Navy folder in my bag beneath this table. Keystone Hospitality Group, LLC, Delaware registered, operating agreement notarized and filed, Athena K. Exley, 70% ownership interest, sole managing member, full signing authority on all major transactions, capital decisions, and personnel actions. Daniel Marsh, 10% non-managing stakeholder, senior operations director, salary of $115,000 annually. 0 legal authority to bind the company, restructure its debt, approve capital expenditure above $10,000, or terminate any employee above property manager level. Harrove Capital Partners, 20% equity stake, passive. 9 years of documented, notarized, legally airtight truth. 9 years of instruments reading clearly, correctly, without ambiguity. In a cockpit nobody at this table had ever been invited to see. If you have ever been the load-bearing wall of something, the actual structure holding the building upright, while everyone outside admired the facade and credited someone else for the architecture, stay with me, because what happened that night was not a breaking point. It was not accumulated bitterness, finally finding its exit. It was a planned procedure, a filed flight plan executed at the moment I had chosen, at the altitude I had prepared for, with documents I had been organizing for longer than anyone in that dining room suspected. Across the room, past the amber warmth of the dining area, through the service pass-through where the kitchen lights burned white and steady, I saw Declan. He stood at the counter in clean chef's whites, arms crossed with the comfortable stillness of a man who had learned to be calm in moving environments. He had been executive chef at Hargrove & Sons for 3 years. I had known him for 6, since the opening of our second property, when I hired him to build a food and beverage program from concept to execution, and he delivered something so far beyond the brief that I tripled his fee without being asked. He knew what was in the Navy folder in my bag. He was one of 4 people in this city who did. He looked at me across the dining room, not obviously, not in a way anyone tracking his gaze would identify as significant, and gave me the smallest possible nod. Not sympathy, not pity, just clean, professional acknowledgement. Instrument to instrument, across the noise of 14 guests and Crystal and Diane's carefully managed performance. I see you. I know what you're carrying. I'm here when you need me. I looked down at my plate. The scallop was seared perfectly. Golden crust centered in brown butter that caught the amber light and held it. The kind of plating that communicates mastery without announcing it. The culinary equivalent of the dress I was wearing. I cut it, ate it slowly. The brown butter was perfect. The aircraft was level. The folder was in my bag, and I had been holding this altitude for 9 years, waiting with the patience of someone who knows that timing is not weakness, that silence is not surrender, and that the most permanent kind of correction is the one the other person never sees coming until the instruments are already in front of them. There is a specific kind of preparation that has no drama in it. No late-night crying over old photographs, no bitter journaling at a kitchen table with a glass of wine and a grievance list. No moment of decision where the music swells and you look at yourself in the mirror and say, "Enough." That is not how I operate. I am a pilot, I file flight plans, I check weather, I calculate fuel loads with a reserve margin built in for contingencies I have not yet imagined. I do not take off and figure out the route in the air. I know where I'm going before the wheels leave the ground, and I know exactly what I will do if the approach goes wrong. What I built over 9 years was not a revenge plan. It was a contingency procedure, and the difference matters. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the romantic beginning, not the charity gala where Daniel Marsh stood beside me at the open bar and told me he thought my uniform was a costume and made me laugh harder than I expected. That story exists. It was real. I am not going to tell you it wasn't. I'm going to tell you what came after. Year 1 of our marriage, I was still flying. Long-haul routes mostly. Frankfurt, Dubai, Singapore, occasionally Sydney. The schedule was brutal in the way that only aviation schedules are brutal. Not long hours in one place, but the specific exhaustion of crossing time zones so frequently that your body stops trusting its own signals about when to sleep and when to be awake. I was home 11 days a month on average. Daniel was building what he called a hospitality concept, a vague and optimistic phrase that, at that stage, consisted of a business plan document, a logo he'd commissioned from a freelancer, and a burning conviction that the boutique hotel market in our city was underserved. He wasn't wrong about the market. He was significantly wrong about what it would take to enter it. The first time I looked at his business plan, really looked at it, the way I look at a weather briefing before a transatlantic departure, I found 17 structural problems in the financial model, not errors of ambition, errors of arithmetic. His RevPAR assumptions were based on a comp set that didn't reflect our target market. His construction cost estimates were 18% below what the actual contractor bids would come in at. His debt service schedule assumed an interest rate environment that had not existed for 4 years. I fixed them. Quietly, over a weekend, while he was at a brunch. I rebuilt the model from the revenue line down, reran the sensitivity analysis across 3 scenarios, and left the updated file on his desktop with a note that said, "Revised. Take a look when you get a chance." He looked at it. He said, "This is incredible. You're so good at this." Then he sent it to 3 potential investors under his name. I noted that, filed it, continued. The first property took 18 months from concept to opening. I was the one who found the location, a former boutique inn on a corner lot in the emerging arts district, undervalued because the previous operator had run it into the ground with deferred maintenance and a reputation problem I calculated we could reverse in under 2 years. I was the one who structured the acquisition. I negotiated the purchase price down 11% from asking by commissioning an independent property condition assessment and using the deferred maintenance backlog as a leverage point in the final round of negotiations. Daniel was there for the handshake. He is very good at handshakes. He is very good at the specific energy of a room in the moment when something is being finalized. The warmth, the confidence, the sense of forward momentum that makes other people feel they have made the right decision. That is a real skill. I am not dismissing it. I am telling you what it is and what it is not. It is not the skill that found the property, structured the deal, secured the financing, managed the renovation, hired the opening team, and filed the operating agreement with the state of Delaware on a Thursday afternoon while sitting in the parking lot of a building supply store, because the contractor needed a decision on tile specifications by end of day. And I had a capital call document due to our bridge lender by 5 p.m. That Thursday exists in my records. I have the emails, I have the timestamps, I have the signed documents and the filed certificates and the bank statements and the contractor correspondence and the lender. Communications. 9 years of paper trail that tells, with the dry and irrefutable specificity of legal documentation, exactly who built what and when and how. If you are the kind of person who keeps receipts, not out of suspicion, not out of bitterness, but simply because you are organized and you understand that memory is unreliable and documentation is not, you already know what I am describing. Drop a comment, because this is not about revenge. This is about the habit of a precise mind operating in an environment that required precision to survive. By year 3, I had transitioned out of active flight operations. Not because Daniel asked me to, not because Diane suggested, over a Sunday lunch, that it might be more practical for me to be more available, though she did suggest that with the warm and reasonable tone of someone who has already decided and is simply narrating the decision out loud. I stepped back from the flight line because Keystone Hospitality Group had reached the stage of growth where the operational demands could no longer be managed part-time, and I was not willing to manage it part-time. I had built something real. I was not going to half-fly it. I kept my license current. I maintained my medical certification. I flew recurrency hours twice a year in a simulator facility 2 hours from our city, on my own schedule, at my own expense, telling no one in the Marsh family because it was mine and it was not their information to have. When Diane told people I had given up flying when things got serious with the company, I let her. The altimeter still read correctly. The attitude indicator still showed level flight. The instruments did not require her understanding to function. Year 4 was when I understood, with complete and irreversible clarity, what I was actually inside. We had 2 properties by then. The first was performing above projection. The second, a converted Victorian in the historic district, 12 rooms, a small event space, and a garden that had become unexpectedly popular for intimate weddings, had opened 6 months prior and was trending toward a break-even position ahead of schedule. Harrove Capital had come in as investors on the second acquisition, and their 20% stake had given us the capital to accelerate the renovation timeline and open 8 weeks earlier than originally planned. At the Harrove Capital Investor Dinner, a quarterly update meeting held at their downtown offices, catered, formal, attended by the 3 partners and 2 associates, Daniel stood at the head of the conference table and presented the performance metrics I had prepared. He presented them well. He hit the key numbers, handled the follow-up questions with the broad strokes confidence of someone who had read the summary page carefully, and closed the meeting with a forward-looking statement about our expansion pipeline that I had written word for word in a bullet-pointed briefing document the evening before. After the meeting, one of the Harrove associates, a woman in her early 30s named Priya, sharp and watchful in the way of someone who processes information faster than the room gives her credit for, caught me in the hallway while Daniel was saying goodbye to the partners. She said, "You built the model, didn't you?" It was not a question. I looked at her. She said, "I recognized the structure. Same sensitivity framework as the acquisition deck. Same formatting on the assumptions tab. I've been in a lot of these meetings." She paused. "You should be in that room." I said, "I was in that room." She looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis they were not entirely sure they wanted confirmed. Then she said, "Fair enough," and walked back toward the conference room. I stood in that hallway for approximately 45 seconds. Then I walked to my car, sat down, and began drafting the framework for what would eventually become the most important document I ever created. Not a business plan, not a financial model, not a lease agreement or a loan covenant or a construction contract. A personal record, comprehensive, chronological, documented with the same discipline I applied to everything else. Every decision I had made, every document I had signed, every email I had sent, every meeting I had run, every crisis I had managed, every invoice I had approved, every contractor I had hired, every lender I had negotiated with, every investor update I had written, organized by property, by year, by function, cross-referenced against the operating agreement and the company bank records and the legal filings. Not because I was planning something, because I finally understood that I needed to be able to prove something. And the difference, at that moment, felt important. By year 7, I had restructured our ownership documentation with the help of a corporate attorney named Sandra Osei, a woman I had found through a professional referral, retained privately, paid from my personal account, and never once mentioned to Daniel. Sandra was methodical, precise, and utterly without sentiment about the work she did. I respected that. She reviewed the original operating agreement, identified 3 provisions that created ambiguity about management authority in the event of a dispute, and recommended a restructured agreement that closed those gaps with language so airtight it would survive any challenge a reasonably competent opposing counsel could mount. Daniel signed the restructured agreement. He signed it because I told him it was a routine update recommended by our corporate counsel for compliance purposes, which was true, as far as it went. He signed it at the kitchen island on a Wednesday evening, between checking his phone and pouring himself a second glass of wine without reading past the signature page. I watched him sign it. I felt nothing dramatic in that moment. No satisfaction, no sorrow, no sense of arriving at a destination. What I felt was the specific, quiet relief of a pilot who has just confirmed that the backup navigation system is functional, not because the primary system has failed, but because you never fly without confirming the backup. That is not paranoia. That is procedure. Sandra notarized the agreement the following day. I filed it that afternoon. I put the original in a fireproof document safe in my home office, and I put a certified copy in a Navy folder that I moved, 3 weeks before the Hargrove and Sons dinner, into the bag I carried to every professional engagement. Just in case. The weeks before the dinner, I had begun to notice a pattern accelerating. Daniel's public identity as founder and CEO of Keystone Hospitality Group had calcified into something that no longer felt like a convenient simplification and had begun to feel like an active reconstruction. He had given 2 interviews, one to a local business journal, one to a podcast about entrepreneurship, in which he described the founding of the company in the first-person singular with a specificity and confidence that told me he had told the story so many times it had replaced the actual memory. He talked about his vision for the first property. He talked about his decision to bring in outside capital. He talked about the contractor crisis on the Revel renovation as a moment when he had to make a hard call. And the hard call he described bore no structural resemblance to what had actually happened, but was internally coherent in the way that revised stories become internally coherent over time, their edges smoothed by repetition into something that feels true, because it has been told so many times. Whitney had begun CCing herself on company email threads she had no operational role in the quiet, preparatory way of someone positioning for an arrival. Brad had mentioned at a dinner 3 weeks prior that he had been looking into the hospitality sector as a potential career pivot. And Diane had begun introducing Daniel at social events as the man behind Keystone, with the specific emphasis of someone installing a plaque. I had watched all of this with the instrument-reading patience of a pilot in cruise at altitude, watching a weather system develop 200 miles ahead. Not reacting, not adjusting course prematurely. Tracking, calculating. Waiting for the moment when the system would be directly in front of me, and the correct action would be clear, clean, and irrevocable. That moment, I had decided, was the Hargrove and Sons dinner. Not because I had planned to confront anyone, not because I had reached a limit of emotional endurance and needed an exit, but because the guest list, Diane's garden club, the social infrastructure of her reputation in this city, represented something I had identified as strategically significant, a witness set, the people whose understanding of what had happened would shape the public narrative of what Keystone was and who had built it. I had not chosen the evening. Diane had chosen it. She had assembled exactly the audience I would have assembled if I had been planning a demonstration rather than a dinner. I sat at the table to Daniel's left, with the Navy folder in my bag and Declan 40 feet away, behind the kitchen pass-through and 9 years of documentation organized in a format that any competent reader would understand within 4 minutes. I was not waiting for permission. I was waiting for the right moment in the approach, the specific point in the descent profile where the runway is aligned, the aircraft is configured, and the variables have reduced themselves to a single, correct, executable action. In aviation, we call it the stabilized approach criteria. Everything stable, everything confirmed. Full commitment from that point forward. I ate the scallop. I listened to Diane describe Daniel's vision for the 8th property. I watched Cecilia lean toward him with the unconscious deference of someone who had already decided where the gravity was in the room. I breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. The approach was stabilized. There is a moment in every long flight when the calculation changes. Not the fuel, not the weather, not the routing. Something quieter than all of those. A shift in the pilot's internal relationship to the aircraft and the destination. The moment when endurance becomes intention, when you stop simply managing the conditions and begin actively executing the arrival. I felt that shift at 9:47 p.m., between the 3rd course and the dessert, when Daniel Marsh could not answer a simple question about his own company. Or rather, my company. It started with Gerald Haynes, Margot's husband, the hospital board member, the municipal planning committee fixture, had arrived late, slipping into the empty chair beside his wife, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd course, with the unhurried ease of a man who has never once in his adult life worried that his arrival time would be held against him. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the particular brand of quiet authority that comes not from aggression, but from decades of being the most consequential person in most rooms. He shook Daniel's hand across the table, said he'd heard good things about Keystone. Said a colleague of his, an investor in the commercial real estate space, had mentioned our name twice in the past month. Daniel smiled, said he appreciated that. Gerald said, "The Revel's performing well, from what I hear. What's your current RevPAR, running against the competitive set?" The table did not go quiet. That would have required someone else to notice what I noticed, the specific, almost imperceptible delay between Gerald's question and Daniel's response. Not the pause of someone gathering their thoughts. The pause of someone searching for a number they had never actually known. "We're tracking well above market," Daniel said. Gerald nodded slowly, the nod of a man who recognized a non-answer and had decided, for the moment, to let it pass. "Rough figure?" Daniel reached for his wine glass. "I'd have to pull the exact numbers. We track it monthly." "Of course," Gerald said pleasantly, and turned to speak to Margot. Across the table, I watched Priya, Harrove Capital's associate, whom I had not realized was among the evening's guests until she had appeared at Gerald's side as his +1, write something briefly on the small notepad she kept in her jacket pocket. She did not look at me, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way I recognized from the hallway outside the Harrove offices 3 years ago. Hypothesis confirmed. If you have ever watched someone perform a version of your work, speak about it confidently, accept credit for it, stand inside it like a borrowed coat, and felt not anger, but something colder and more precise, leave a comment, because what I felt at that moment was not the hot, uncontrolled energy of someone who has finally had enough. It was the specific, clarifying sensation of a pilot who has just confirmed that the weather ahead is exactly what the instruments predicted. I had known this was coming. I had built the approach for exactly this moment. Gerald's question had disturbed something in the room's social atmosphere. Not visibly, not in a way Diane's garden club would have named or tracked, but the disturbance was there, a subtle pressure change, the way humidity shifts before a storm system arrives. Margot was still smiling. Cecilia was still attentive, but their attention had reoriented by 3 degrees. Enough to matter. Portia asked about the 8th property. Which city? What concept? Daniel described it with the broad confidence of a man reciting a summary he had heard rather than a plan he had made. Coastal location, boutique motor court concept, 34 rooms, repositioning play in an underserved market. He had those details because I had mentioned them, once, in passing. "Who's your GC on the renovation?" Portia's husband asked. A man named Charles, who had said almost nothing all evening and apparently had a background in construction I had not known about. Daniel said the name of the firm I had been in preliminary conversations with. Got it right. Charles nodded. Good outfit. Worked with them on a mixed-use project on the east side. What's the conditional use permit situation? That corridor has some complicated zoning. The pause this time was longer. Not dramatically longer. 4 seconds, perhaps 5, but at a dinner table, in a room where the conversation had been flowing continuously for 2 hours, 5 seconds of silence carries weight. It lands. It is felt by everyone, even those who could not have told you afterward exactly what they had felt or why. Daniel said, "We're working through the municipal process." Charles said, "Sure. Which variance track, administrative or public hearing?" Daniel looked at me. He looked at me the way a pilot looks at the co-pilot when an unfamiliar system alert appears on the panel. The instinctive, reflexive turn toward the person they know has the answer. He had not planned to look at me. He was not performing anything in that moment. He simply looked because I was the person who knew, and some part of him understood that with the clear, unthinking certainty of long habit. The table saw it, not all of them, but enough. Priya saw it. I watched her see it without appearing to watch anything at all. The downward movement of her eyes to the notepad, the small addition to whatever she had already written. Diane saw it. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes tightened. The specific tension of a person watching a structure they have built begin to show a crack they cannot immediately explain. Whitney saw it. Her champagne glass paused halfway to her mouth and stayed there for a moment before she completed the motion with the careful deliberateness of someone who had decided to look unaffected. I answered Charles's question, quietly, factually. The administrative variance track, because the property's existing non-conforming use status qualified us for a streamlined review process rather than a full public hearing. We had submitted the preliminary application 3 weeks prior. We expected a determination within 60 days. Charles said, "Smart approach. Most operators don't know about the streamlined track." I said, "It required some research." The table absorbed this. Daniel said nothing. He picked up his wineglass. He took a slow sip. He did not look at me again. Here is the moment I want you to understand. Not the moment when I answered Charles's question. Not the moment when Daniel looked at me. The moment that came after. The 40-second stretch of resumed dinner conversation, dessert menus being passed, Diane redirecting the table's attention toward a story about a charity auction she was organizing, when I sat in my chair and felt the arithmetic complete itself. 9 years of labor, 9 years of documentation, 9 years of signed agreements and filed certificates and restructured debt and managed crises and investor presentations and contractor negotiations. All of it reducible, in the social calculus of this room, to Athena, who knows some things that are useful to Daniel. Not the founder, not the managing member, not the woman who had built every single one of those 7 properties from the ground up while maintaining a 70% ownership stake that nobody at this table had ever been shown. The resource, the support structure, the useful, quiet, unacknowledged infrastructure of a success that wore someone else's name to dinner. In aviation, there is a concept called crew resource management, the discipline of utilizing every available resource on the flight deck effectively. The problem it was designed to solve was a specific pattern of accidents in which highly capable co-pilots and flight engineers failed to communicate critical information to captains whose authority they did not feel empowered to challenge. Aircraft flew into mountains because the person who knew the terrain was not the person whose title permitted them to speak. I had been the co-pilot in my own company. Not because Daniel had taken authority from me. The operating agreement had never permitted that. But because I had allowed the social performance of his authority, the handshakes, the interviews, the charcoal suit, the dinner table confidence, to go unchallenged. Because I had calculated for 9 years that the cost of the correction was higher than the cost of the silence. I had been wrong about that arithmetic, not emotionally wrong, strategically wrong. The cost of the silence had been compounding at a rate I had failed to accurately model, not in my financial position, which was protected, but in something harder to quantify and more important to recover: the truth. The simple, documented, legally airtight truth of who had built what, and the growing distance between that truth and the story this room believed, the story Diane's garden club would carry home tonight and repeat at the next luncheon, the story that would calcify further with every interview Daniel gave, and every dinner Diane hosted, and every promise Whitney received, and every assumption Brad calculated his future against. The distance was becoming unclosable, unless I closed it now. Dessert arrived, a small chocolate tart, glossy and precise, the kind of thing that requires technical skill to execute and communicates that skill through its geometry rather than announcing it. Declan's work. He had a gift for letting the food speak in the register of quiet confidence rather than performance. I looked across the room to the kitchen pass-through. He was there. He had been there at intervals all evening, appearing briefly at the counter, confirming the service rhythm, disappearing back into the kitchen. Each time I had looked, he had been watching me with the calm, patient attention of someone who knew what was in the folder and understood what it meant, and was simply waiting for me to decide when. This time, when I looked, he gave me a different signal. Not the small nod of acknowledgement, something more specific, a fractional tilt of his head toward the service corridor, the kind of gesture that only reads as a gesture if you know to look for it. When you're ready. I looked at the chocolate tart in front of me. I looked at Daniel, who was telling Margot something about the coastal property with the reconstructed confidence of a man who had recalibrated after the turbulence and decided the flight was still his to captain. I looked at Diane, who was watching her son with the focused satisfaction of someone who has invested everything in a single asset and cannot afford to reassess its value. I looked at the navy folder in my bag, its edges visible between my chair leg and my left knee. 4 counts in, 4 counts held. The stabilized approach criteria were met. Full commitment from this point forward. I placed my napkin on the table, picked up the folder, stood up quietly, no announcement, no performance, just the simple physical fact of standing, and walked toward the kitchen, passed through where Declan was waiting, and the service corridor light burned white and steady beyond him. Behind me, I heard Diane say something to Cecilia. I did not turn around. The runway was aligned. The aircraft was configured. The approach was stable. There was nothing left to calculate. I walked through the service corridor with the navy folder in my hand and Declan 2 steps ahead of me. And for the first time in 9 years, I felt the specific, grounded calm of a pilot who has completed the checklist, confirmed the approach, and committed to the landing. No turbulence ahead that I had not already accounted for. No variable I had not already modeled. Declan stopped at the entrance to the private dining room's service alcove, a small neutral space between the kitchen and the main floor, used by staff for staging and by management for quiet conversations that required privacy without the formality of an office. He turned to face me. His expression was the same as it had been all evening, calm, present, professionally steady. He said, "You sure?" I said. "File it under rhetorical questions." The corner of his mouth moved. He stepped aside. I walked back into the dining room. I did not make an announcement. I did not tap a glass, or raise my voice, or position myself at the head of the table in a way that performed authority before establishing it. I simply walked to the serving counter at the room's edge, the flat, marble-topped surface where Declan's team staged the courses, and set the navy folder down with the quiet, specific weight of something that had been carried a long time and was finally being put in its correct place. The nearest guests noticed first. Then the ripple moved outward, the way attention always moves in a room, not because of sound, but because of stillness. I was still. In a room full of dinner conversation and Crystal and Diane's carefully managed social architecture, my stillness was the loudest thing present. Daniel noticed. His expression shifted through 3 registers in under 2 seconds. Recognition, confusion, a flicker of something I can only describe as the look of a pilot who has just seen an unexpected system alert and has not yet decided what it means. I opened the folder. "I want to clarify something," I said, not loudly, clearly, the voice I use when I am transmitting on a congested frequency and need to be understood the first time. For the table. Diane said, "Athena." Keystone Hospitality Group, LLC, I said, is a Delaware-registered limited liability company. The operating agreement, notarized and filed, designates the following ownership structure. I turned the document to face the table. Athena K. Exley, 70% ownership interest, sole managing member, full signing authority on all capital decisions, personnel actions, and major transactions. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the thing that has been present but unspoken has finally been named aloud and everyone is recalibrating simultaneously. Daniel Marsh, 10% non-managing stakeholder, Senior Operations Director, salary of $115,000 annually, drawn from a company he did not found, did not capitalize, and cannot legally bind without my signature. I heard Whitney make a sound, not a word. Just a sound, the involuntary exhalation of someone whose future has just been restructured without their consent. Daniel stood up. He said my name. He said it with the specific inflection of a man who is accustomed to that being sufficient. The sound of his saying it, carrying its own authority, its own request for compliance. He had said my name in that register many times over 9 years, and I had, many times, responded to it. I looked at him. I said, "The Revel renovation crisis in month 3. I managed it. The Harrove capital equity structure. I built it. The zoning variance on the coastal property. I filed the application. Every financial model, every investor deck, every restructured loan covenant, every contractor negotiation across all 7 properties. Documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced against the company's bank records and legal filings." I placed a second document on top of the first, the personal record I had built from the hallway outside the Harrove offices. 3 years ago, on the afternoon Priya had confirmed what she already knew. Priya, from her seat beside Gerald Haynes, looked at the document and then looked at me with the expression of someone who has waited 3 years for a hypothesis to reach its conclusion. Diane spoke. She said it was inappropriate. She said it was a misunderstanding. She said the documents didn't reflect the full picture, that Daniel had contributed in ways that weren't captured in legal filings, that partnership meant more than percentages, that I was humiliating her son in front of people who respected him. Her voice was controlled for the first 4 sentences. By the 5th, it had acquired a vibration I had never heard in it before. Not anger exactly, but the sound of a structure under load it was not designed to carry. The sound of a story that has been told so many times it replaced memory, encountering documentation for the first time. I let her finish. Then I said quietly, "I know you believe that." I picked up the folder. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, the way I'd not permitted myself to look for a long time, with the full, unguarded attention of someone who has finally stopped managing the gap between what is true and what is being performed. He looked back at me, and in his eyes I saw the thing I had not let myself look for until this moment. Not surprise, not betrayal, recognition. The particular, exhausted recognition of a man who has known the truth for a long time and has been hoping, with increasing desperation, that it would never require him to stand in it publicly. I said, "Daniel's operational role with Keystone will be terminated effective Monday. His system access and corporate authority will be revoked under the terms of the operating agreement. All client relationships and vendor contracts will be redirected to my office." I picked up my bag. I'm also filing for divorce. No drama in my voice. No tremor, no performance of pain or triumph or any of the things the room was waiting for me to perform. Just information, delivered with the clarity of a final transmission before frequency change. I closed the folder, put it under my arm. Diane said something. Whitney said something. Brad said something to the man beside him. Quiet and urgent, and I did not stop to hear any of it, because none of it was relevant to the approach I had already committed to and the runway I was already on. I walked past the table, past the crystal and the linen and the place card that said Athena in someone else's calligraphy. Past the garden club, women who would carry this evening home and discuss it tomorrow, and whose understanding of it, I had decided, was no longer something I needed to manage. At the doorway, I passed Declan, who was standing with his arms crossed and his expression neutral and professional and steady. He said very quietly, "Safe travels, boss." I said, "Thank you, Declan," and I walked out. There is a procedure pilots follow after a completed approach and landing, a shutdown checklist, methodical and sequential, that confirms every system has been properly secured before you leave the aircraft. It is not dramatic, it is not emotional, it is simply the final set of correct actions performed in the correct order after a flight is complete. I sat in my car in the Belmont Tower parking structure for 6 minutes. I confirmed the divorce attorney's number was in my phone. It was. I confirmed the Monday morning meeting with Sandra Osei was in my calendar. It was. I confirmed the folder was in my bag. It was. Then I started the car and drove home through a city that looked exactly the same as it always had. The same grid of lights, the same familiar routing. and felt, for the first time in 9 years, that I was flying it at the correct altitude with the correct instruments, under my own name. The approach had been stabilized, the landing was complete,